Hello everyone, welcome to our Egyptian online seminar group. First, keep your microphones off. Then, if you have any questions, you can ask our speaker during his presentation or after his presentation. I have great pleasure of welcoming Professor Doug Stevens. Professor Doug Stevens is one of the top accounting thought leaders in the world. He is the director of the School of Accountancy of the Mack Robinson College of Business at Georgia State University. Doug's research has been published in top-ranking journals in accounting, including the Accounting Review, Contemporary Accounting Research, Accounting Organization and Society, Journal of Management Accounting Research, and Behavior Research in Accounting. Now we will start our seminar with Professor Doug Stevens.
Thank you, Mohammed. You are very kind. And I want to thank you again for organizing this. It's been a great opportunity to participate as a viewer and now as a speaker. And I look forward to your comments. I'm going to do the Robert Bloomfield strategy, and I'm going to talk for 4 slides and stop and say, are there any comments or questions? So throughout my presentation, feel free to speak up, and I'll be stopping periodically because this is more about a discussion. It's a discussion we've been having for a long time, and I think the COVID outbreak has kind of brought some things to the head, and I think it's a good time to revisit some of those things. Don't look to me for an example, because once again, I did something crazy. So 3 years ago, I listened to our dean convince me that I needed to take 3 years and be the director of the School of Accountancy. So right when I was starting to really get some traction on some of my social norm theory and research and some of my trading volume theory and research, he convinced me it was a good idea to go into administration. So the bad news is I am exhausted, and I am very excited about going back into the faculty in June. The good news is I've learned that business schools have a whole lot of stakeholders, and they all have different points of view. They all have different objectives, and so I've been exposed to a lot of different points of view, and it's been very, very useful to me as a director of the School of Accountancy. So it's been a very good experience in that way. I've been able to discuss some of my research with accounting firms, national accounting firms and international accounting firms, the Atlanta chapter of the Institute for Internal Audit, Deloitte, and I've also been able to make similar presentations internationally to the National University of Singapore, to the Amsterdam Business School, to Clemson, and to, again, some of the Atlanta area schools. I have really enjoyed having some of the scholars here today in at Georgia State, and to develop more of our research potential at Georgia State. So this is all a very valuable community, and it's a very interesting time for all of us. And so what I'd like to do today is talk about the emerging results in economics-based research and accounting. So we have been talking about the Chicago School for a long time. Many of us have been trained. When I was at Indiana for my Ph.D., I was trained very deeply in the Chicago School. I would say I was inbred in the Chicago School, and there are things about that powerful theory that I think we need to defend, and we need to continue. However, there is an awful lot that we can do to expand the theory and make it more relevant to all the stakeholders that I've been mentioning, and of course, including our students, who understand that capitalism is worth defending, but they want a reason to defend capitalism. So this has all been brought to a head, and I look forward to your comments. So first, I want to talk about the overarching influence of the Chicago School, what the implications have been for public policy, for business education, especially in the United States, where it's been prominent. I spent a semester at Glasgow University 10 years ago, and I learned some things about Adam Smith that I didn't know before. And turns out that the Chicago School didn't get Adam Smith. So he was a poor example, a poor poster child for their narrow view of capitalism. But I think he's a great starting point for us to move on and to develop the new Chicago School. So I'm going to talk about that. Then I'm going to talk about how neoclassical economists have really already moved on. In many cases, they've changed their mind about their underlying assumption. And one large example is Michael Jensen in finance. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and maybe we really are ready for that paradigm shift that we've been talking about for decades. Then I want to talk about some results in my own research dealing with social norms and market efficiency related to analyst forecasts. And then I want to definitely get to the implications for accounting theory and practice. I've learned that when I'm talking to practitioners, they want to talk about their problems today. And when I talk to my students, I say, we want to definitely be practical minded, practice minded. But in academia, the difference is we also are all about theory. And so this is a good time to talk about the implications for accounting theory as well as practice. Okay, so where did we get the Chicago School? Most people trace this powerful, useful paradigm to Milton Friedman's 1953 essay called The Methodology of Positive Economics. And his essay shaped economists' conceptions of what constituted good theory and good empirical evidence. So we have researchers that go back and they've actually looked at economics research post-1953, and they see a trend. So research in economics became more mathematical, more analytical, less historical, less institutional, more standardized, and more narrow regarding admissible priors or assumptions. Now this methodology spread very quickly from economics to economics-based research in accounting and finance. So already at the time, neoclassical economists had come to dominate economics. And so institutional economists, when they wanted to start the university-based business school, they kind of ignored a lot of what was going on in their own their own subject. And in time, however, that same strong methodology took over in accounting and finance. In accounting, we were so influenced by Friedman's essay that we named our application of his research methodology positive accounting theory. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about Watson Zimmerman's book. I don't know how many of you remember covering this in your PhD program. Mark, I don't know if they taught that at Pittsburgh. But I'll be referencing that a little bit just to show how much Milton Friedman's positive economic theory poured over into accounting theory and research. So inspired by Friedman's positive theory, the Chicago School developed a rigorous theory that characterized the firm as made up of principal-agent relationships. And this theory has been called agency theory. And here are some of the behavioral assumptions. Preferences only for wealth and leisure. So in their work for the principal, agents are motivated to maximize their pay and minimize their effort. Also, agents are risk averse, whereas principals are risk neutral, or at least agents are less risk neutral than principals. And above all, the assumption of opportunistic self-interest. So agents are not motivated by the welfare of others, such as the principal, or any other concern other than maximizing their pay and minimizing their effort. To this, they added another behavioral assumption that's especially important to the theory of the firm, and that's the assumption of rational expectations or rationality. So agents are assumed to be fully rational in maximizing their pay and minimizing their effort. So in summary, the theory of the firm out of Chicago characterizes individuals as fully rational utility maximizers. But remember, they only have preferences for wealth and leisure. So they're fully rational, they're greedy, and they're lazy. So given these behavioral assumptions, agency theory relies on powerful financial incentives and contracting to control opportunistic behavior on the part of the agent. So while the theory has proven particularly useful in accounting and finance because we focus on these contractual and financial incentives, the theory is proven to be not useful or to provide little support for informal, non-financial controls based on culture and social norms. The Chicago School added one more critical assumption to market-based research in accounting and finance. And to understand the theory, this is another very important assumption. So they assume that stock market prices are highly efficient in conveying information related to the future cash flows of the firm. And we know that's the economic definition of the intrinsic value of the firm, or what stock price should reflect. So this underlying assumption was very important in supporting the seminal papers in the late 1960s, such as Ball and Brown and Beaver in 1968. And it generated a large literature in market reaction studies. And when you go back again to Watson Zimmerman's book on positive accounting theory, you see that they're really trying to sell this new paradigm out of Chicago. So they describe the new theory and the methodology, and they explain how it's been met with resistance. But then they say over time, the approach gained popularity, and papers based on it now constitute a large fraction of papers published by the leading academic journals. And that is even more true, or has increased in prevalence over the decades, especially in the economics-based journals out of Chicago. So what have been the implications for public policy? So you can see the implications of this view of capitalism and the firm in the policy statements of its leading advocates. Now, some of these statements have not weathered too well. So first, Milton Friedman, in his 1970 article published in the New York Times, said that the theory of the firm out of Chicago left the corporation with no social responsibility other than to increase profits for its shareholders. Now, Friedman was never one to mince words, so he went on further. He said that asking the corporation to promote any other social responsibility, such as providing employment, eliminating discrimination, or avoiding pollution, was preaching pure and unadulterated socialism. So he just pushed out those discussions by accusing them of being an abdication or a veiled support for socialism. George Stigler, in applying Friedman's methodology of political or positive economics to public policy, developed a theory of economic regulation that reduced such regulation to narrow self-interest on the part of regulators and their constituents. Now, if you go back and read that, it just is a clear application of the assumptions of the theory of the firm. to public policy. And then Watson Zimmerman, in their paper in 1978, took a similar approach in characterizing the standard setting process in accounting as a conflict between self-interested parties, including accounting firms and regulators. So again, Stigler and Watson Zimmerman basically attributed public policy or accounting and finance regulation to narrow self-interest on the part of the regulators. So it didn't seem to provide much validity or support for such efforts. Now, Michael Jensen, I want to focus on him here. He used agency theory to encourage some forms of organizational control and to discourage others. For example, Jensen helped legitimize the takeover movement in the 1980s by presenting it as an important aspect of corporate governance. And you still have a very strong literature in corporate governance today. Jensen also has gone further in discouraging the use of various other organizational controls. And as a managerial accounting, I find this very, very disturbing or at least controversial at a minimum. So in a Harvard Business Review article, Jensen discouraged the use of participative budgeting because it only encouraged managers to lie and cheat. Okay, that has never, ever caught on. Firms still use participative budgeting as one of the most popular organizational controls. Also, Jensen discouraged the use of the balanced scorecard. So I think other accountants at Harvard, including Robert Kaplan, would probably disagree with this. But what Michael Jensen said is that the balanced scorecard was inefficient because maximizing the total market value of the firm is the only objective function needed by management to efficiently run an organization. So in the Business Ethics Quarterly in 2002, you read his article saying that no, the balanced scorecard, no, is not very useful, inefficient. And again, you see that emphasis on the narrow view of economics and the firm. So I'm going to stop right there and ask if there are any comments or questions before I move on here.
May I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Thanks, Doug, for this introduction. It's it's great to hear you talking about these insights. I always wondered, and also with the reference that you just gave to Jensen, right? I mean, I can see why you would be interested in the end only in the financial result. But the road that leads to that result, right, needs to be visible or visualized, right? So I never saw any light between using non-financials and using balanced scorecards, or using business models to understand how you get from A to B, where B is then the financial, right? So where does this criticism or this skepticism, if you like, come from?
Yeah, Kaplan's been on this program. I've not had a chance to really talk to.
Yeah. No, I'm still
him.
here, Doug. So let me respond.
Oh, there he is. There. Okay.
Yeah. So
I will let Bob discuss.
Yeah, Mike was a colleague of mine, even less well known, as I was one of the 3-person subcommittee that actually recruited him to come to Harvard from Rochester. And we got along fine until we didn't. So you have to view Mike's statement, in his thinking. And his thinking is, well, I think there's 2 critical elements. One is he's just dealing with incentives. He never really understood the role for accounting information for information to inform you. He was using it only, as you say, in its narrowest sense, or one which is contracting and incentives. And that's why, he even said, if you have more than one measure, you have no measures because you confuse you. And my response to him was, I would never get in an airplane that Michael was the pilot of. because he would have only a single instrument showing the airport where he intended to land. That was the outcome, but didn't use information for guidance and information. And if anything, an airline pilot and the passengers have incentives that are perfectly aligned. They do want to arrive at that spot safely, and yet there's still a huge demand for information to pilot the journey. And Mike never really understood that. But the other part also was you didn't need the balanced scorecard because the stock price was a sufficient statistic, literally in a statistical concept, for value created and destroyed during the prior period. And if you had a well-measured statistic that was summarized, whether you added or created value, why would you need anything else? Okay, so when you look at the flaws in his arguments, it relates to both of those. One is it's a narrow information only for contracting, and two is we already have information for contracting, which is the stock price, because it's a sufficient statistic. And so that's where these things, at least my sense is to where Mike rarely makes mistakes in his logic. He's extraordinarily smart person. Those were the two gaps. If you had to go back to figure out what assumption was he making that you didn't agree with, because he didn't make any mistakes in logic and reasoning. But just Doug, as long as I had the floor, I think that the Hand statement about the origins of agency theory coming from Friedman is not really correct. A lot of the mathematics and the analytics in economics really can go back to Samuelson and Ken Arrow and DeBrew, and there was a very rich stream of analytic methods that were occurring in the early 1940s. Samuelson's thesis and his work and his group at MIT. So to attribute to Friedman the mathematization of economics is probably not accurate. The other parts of the quotes were okay, but if you're writing a paper, I would go back and check on that. And if anything, the agency theory that you talk about was independent of Jensen. I mean, there was a set of analytic researchers in economics, Holmstrom, Grossman, Harrison Raviv, Bob Wilson, all of whom were working on multi-person economic models, which had this idea of incentives and risk bearing built into them. And that's what Joel Dembski was relying on, and Jerry Feltham, when they brought that literature into accounting. So Jensen was much more of a verbal Chicago school approach on agency theory, but it was built upon the mathematics, but it was really quite separate from it. Anyway, so that was, I'll get off now.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Yeah, and I go back into that history in my book on the theory of the firm. So yeah, I didn't mean to attribute it all to Milton Friedman. But people in the profession, they know Milton Friedman. They know a little bit about Michael Jensen, and they sure don't know Holmstrom and many of the other ones. But yeah, very good point. Okay, so getting back to what the Chicago schools influence.
Doug?
Yes.
Can I suggest that maybe you, as well as many other people who've read it, tend to have a caricature view of what Milton Friedman wrote in his New York Times essay. In fact, if you go back and you actually read it, you see things like a statement to the effect describing managers' responsibilities. The responsibility is to conduct the business in accordance with shareholder desires, which generally will be to make as much money as possible while conforming to their basic rules of society, both those embodied in law and those embodied in ethical custom. So what Friedman was actually calling for was something that looked like wealth maximization subject to a broad set of constraints, not just a very limited view of the world. And if you go back if you go back and look at his series, Free to Choose, it started out on the very first episode with a joint trip to Hong Kong to look at the free enterprise system. And then he went to Scotland and talked about Adam Smith and what Adam Smith wrote and things like that. And the views that he espoused were not quite as straightforward as a lot of people who read that essay. tend to think they are. It was in fact much broader than that. Not that that has any impact on what you're doing here, but you know, I do think it's
Thank you,
important.
Greg. Yep.
Yeah. Anyway, that's my 2 cents.
It's good 2 cents there. Thank you. Okay, I'll give you plenty of chance to comment more. Let me just add a little bit here, and then I'll pause again. So there has been this recent backlash against the narrow view of capitalism in the firm out of the Chicago School. And there's no better example of that than the Business Roundtable statement. So back in August 19th, 2019, the Business Roundtable, which is comprised of the 181 top CEOs in the US, issued a new statement on the purpose of a corporation. And the new statement represented a significant departure from previous statements issued by the Business Roundtable, narrowing the responsibility of the corporation to shareholder profits. So what the new statement did is it challenged business leaders to ensure that the benefits of capitalism flow to every American. So in particular, the new statement extended corporate responsibility beyond the interests of shareholders to other stakeholders of the firm, including customers, employees, suppliers, and communities. So here you see a major shift in the thinking of the top leaders in these US firms from a Chicago view dominated by the interests of the shareholders to a stakeholder view that's actually been around for a long time. So what's interesting is the Business Roundtable invited comments, pro and con, to their statement. And what I found interesting is the criticisms. The criticisms were often statements that you could have taken out of Milton Friedman's 1970 article. So this is just a veiled attempt to move to socialism. And again, it showed a very strong influence of the Chicago School, even though these business leaders didn't really understand it or really think about it in those terms. So I think it's a good time to go back and talk about the Chicago School. What did they mean? What did they say? And how did it really influence our capitalist system and our corporations? So what have the implications been for business education in the US? So a lot of this is out of Khurana's book in 2007. He identifies 3 phases in the US business school. And again, he starts by saying that it was really quite rare to have a business school in a university setting. So before the 1880 founding of Wharton, most all business schools were private. They were established for public policy reasons, but they were not expected to be a part of the university until Wharton in the 1880s. And what they argued is that business management was a profession, just like law and medicine, with a moral dimension that valued professional norms. So Khurana calls this the Professionalism Project. And like I mentioned earlier, that was driven primarily by institutional economists who were becoming increasingly marginalized in economics by neoclassical economists. And then Khurana talks about a brief second phase in the 1950s, which was a response to some very strong criticisms of the business school by foundations led by Carnegie and the Ford Foundation. And this was the scientific age of management. So we attempted to make management all about technical training and learning the right techniques. And that led very quickly to a third phase in the 1960s and beyond, where business management was viewed primarily as the maximization of stock price. And what Khurana says is that this takeover of business schools in the university represented a revitalized neoclassical theory and an abandonment of the Professionalism Project initiated by institutional economists. So I've talked to people at various schools. I see Jeff Shields. I talked to Greg Waymeyer. When I go back and I try to put some professional norms into my classes, there's seemingly very little from the 1950s until the current time period. But then when you go back before that period, there's a rich literature in professional norms. And when you go back, you see that the university-based business school was founded to transmit professional norms such as integrity, transparency and accountability, responsibility and trustworthiness, competence and disinterestedness, and duties of care and loyalty. So things have changed quite a bit as a result of the Chicago School. So after the 1960s, the university-based business school became increasingly influenced by neoclassical economic theory in the Chicago School. And this led to a more narrow view of managers and the obligations of the firm than institutional economists. Institutional economists emphasized the role of power, values, belief systems, and historical contingency on economic behavior. And so this represented or supported a very broad view of managers and the obligations of the firm. In contrast, neoclassical economics emphasized the role of markets, contracts, trade, and property rights on economic behavior. And you can see why this view was so important in accounting and finance, because again, we emphasize financial controls. But the neoclassical economics supported a narrow view of managers and the obligations of the firm. So in summary, the theory of the firm used in accounting and finance took on a decidedly analytical focus that de-emphasized the legitimacy of management and public policy. And Karana mentions three particular areas where the legitimacy of management and public policy was diminished. So he mentions that the new theory reduced the role of managers to maximizing share price in a highly efficient capital market, that the new theory reduced financial regulation to opportunistic behavior between self-interested regulators and their constituents. And the new theory in particular left no role for culture or social norms in accounting and finance. So I'm going to stop right there and take any comments or questions related to the implications for business education.
Question? Yes.
Yeah, hi, my name is Paul Zarrow, and I was actually a student at Chicago in the 80s. And
Yes.
one of the holy grails there is data, right? If you can't show it with data, then almost like it doesn't exist. Okay, and this has pervaded. I was Eugene Fama was my thesis advisor, and data was holy, right? And that has certainly steeped into accounting and the emphasis now. Can you identify causalities? We say identification. If you can't show it with data, it's like it doesn't exist. Okay, and I think that's a very important issue here because culture and norms and things like that are very difficult to show with data. Whereas focusing on accounting data, stock prices, role of regulation, things like that, things that you can get manifest in empirical result. Okay, those become the things that you can tout. Okay, the things that become part of the literature, and certainly in accounting, to the extent that the major journals have, I don't want to say become captive to this view, but certainly take on this view, starting with the Rochester and Chicago journals. It's very pervasive, and I think basically starting with the Chicago notion of data and how that's pervaded the journals, it's a difficult transition to make to go to things that can't be backed up by data, even though they might well be true, in God's truth. So I just wanted to make that point.
That's a great point. what surprised me when I went back and did the research for my book is how institutional economists used to win Nobel Prizes for their data and their evidence based to historical contingency and culture. And so it's kind of a change in what we find to be acceptable evidence. So now it's stock price data, or increasingly, should I say, trading volume or analyst forecast disagreement measures that we use for our evidence. But before the 1960s, we did accept, who was it? Douglas, who got a Nobel Prize for his cultural and norm-based evidence. So it's very interesting how the whole view of evidence changed after the 1960s.
Yeah, but I even though I do have a Chicago background, I do think it would be healthier for the profession to be a little more open to alternative methods of proof.
Good, very interesting. Good comment. Any other comments before I move on?
Doug,
Yes.
before you go on, I think that slide is a really important one, right? And so I look at those three things, and on number one, I agree that the theory did sort of reduce managers to the role of automatons. That's less important than the other things. The thing on financial regulation, to follow up with Paul, I haven't seen much data that suggests that regulators don't behave as self-interested agents. I think the third one is really where the pop is, right? It's these things, and it shows up in your research as well. It shows up in things like stuff that we learn, and that we learn how to behave as responsible humans in a society where there are others that don't share our interests. And so I think that this slide is spot on. I would amplify it by saying, I don't think all three of those things are equally important. I think the third one is really important.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Thank you.
Professor Bob Kaplan, any questions?
Yeah, so the data issue that Paul raises is really important. And in your history, you also want to look at a related development in Chicago in the 1960s, which was development of the CRISPy database for finance. And that was originally financed by Merrill Lynch. Now, it's not random that Merrill Lynch chose Chicago to create the CRISPy database, because they wanted to show that markets were a good thing and investing in stocks was a good thing. So you didn't have to just invest in bonds, which was for many foundations the only acceptable investment at the time. But the other thing, this is the sociology that you have to trace back, is it made scientific research easy to do without leaving your office. And that had a profound impact, not just on finance and accounting, but all of management research, because you could do this very high quality research with a lot of validity, internal, intrinsic validity, which also had external validity. And we thought that's a general model for management research, and not realize it was a very specialized model that applied only to the capital market story. And getting back to what Paul was saying, when I talked about this in my presidential talk at AAA in 2010, it's in the article in the Accounting Review 2011, there's a wonderful anecdote in economics that in the 16th century, 15th century, people had a general idea of what Africa looked like, what was the overall shape and where the lakes were and the rivers. But then as the discovery era came and people were able to take ships around Africa to go between Western Europe and Asia, they mapped the coastline extremely well. They had extremely fine precision. And if you look at the 19th century maps of Africa, the coastline is perfect, but the inside of Africa is much more blurry. They don't have any rivers or lakes because people didn't go inside the country and they didn't have detailed measurements of what was happening, and therefore was unacceptable getting the quality standards. And I think this is what I wrote about 10 years ago, is that in accounting, because of the CRISPy database and CompuStat, we know a great deal about the outside of accounting between companies and investors and regulators and analysts. And we know less about what's happening inside the firm because no one's going inside the firm to look at the culture, what Paul was talking about, of norms and values and how you play out. Because just like in the mapping of Africa, the data for that would 1 or 2 orders of magnitude less rigorous than the data we had about the interface, the border of accounting, with all the other stakeholders. So those are also factors that are going on, is the need for rigorous research and quality of data driving out what seems to be, actually, it's no less rigorous, but the data are harder to do and you have to leave your office to do it, which was not comfortable, or people didn't have the resources or access to do that.
Thank you, Bob. Good point.
I think that's a terrific analogy. I have a close friend who's a sociology professor, and basically his work, he's an ethnographer, and his work, and he wrote a book about the ghettos starting in Europe 500 years ago. And his work was actually he lived in Venice and Rome and studied firsthand those ghettos rather than just read social theory about ghettos. I think that was a phenomenal analogy. Thank you.
Hey, Doug, a question. So what's interesting about this, as I've studied this literature, is that running concurrently through time is all the work that's been done in management. Things by Mayo, Maslow, Douglas McGregor, in terms of their view of how organizations should work. And it's always been mysterious to me why the twain never really met. Right. So I'm curious as to your view as to why economists really didn't look hard at what was going on in management. Certainly, there have been attempts to try to do integration. But in your opinion, why would these streams of theory and research running parallel and not really meeting?
Oh, boy. Leave it to Mark to give me a tough question.
While you're thinking about, again, Mark, the origins of McGregor and that whole organizational theory of the firm actually did come from research done by Harvard Business School professors in the 1920s, Mayo and Roethlisberger, which was the Hawthorne experiment. And it gets back to what I just said. For them to do that work, they had to go to the Western Electric plants outside Chicago and study and intervene and run experiments on different types of light. Well, that's just harder to do than sitting in my office and spinning tapes. And so the research takes longer, and maybe it's less, some people think less rigorous. And so that's why they stayed on parallel tracks.
Yeah, good point. In my research, I went back to Coase and Williamson and all the early research on the theory of the firm, and many of them didn't like the direction that the Chicago School was taking in their narrowing of the theory. I remember Williamson saying that Milton Friedman was prone to overstatement. And I now know too much in going back and reading. They were trying to sell their new theory. And so Michael Jensen is a very good salesman, Milton Friedman, very good salesman, very smart, and I read their stuff now, and I see in them this attempt to promote their theory. And according to Kuhn, they were just doing their job. They were defending the theory of the firm against criticism, and they did an outstanding job. And I think now is a good time to applaud them and say, now let's build on what they gave us. So is that a satisfactory answer, Mark? Are you going to let me get away with that?
Well, look, I think as Bob mentioned here, that going into the field is difficult. It just seems that certainly you can be zealous about the theory that you're putting forward, but it just seems that virtually nothing was going to move some of these guys in terms of modifying the way that they were thinking. So zealousness or hubris or whatever it was, there's still this huge gap, I think, that we observe, in economics and in management. And I don't know if twain will ever really meet.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a huge gap.
Well, I think, Doug, I think that the progress is glacial. Unfortunately, in accounting, the big problem again is that the journals are very institutionally tied to a way of thinking, and to break that is tough. I mean, I give Greg a great deal of credit. He became more of an institutionalist and historian, but he's the exception that proves the rule. It's very difficult, and then given promotion incentives in major universities, it's glacial.
Yeah.
I would agree with that. But glacial is better than non-existent, right? that there are people out there who push on these things, so when I'm looking at your next slide, it sort of seems like a natural type of thing. George Stigler was the guy who believed that markets constrained managers, and there probably wasn't much point to looking inside firms. And so he was very skeptical of agency theory, Burlean means and all that kind of stuff. And the fact of the matter is those guys had something useful to say. If you wanted to really understand what was happening at a micro level within firms, you had to go inside them, like Bob Kaplan is saying. You had to actually get data on what companies actually did. And that way you could actually start to look at whether what Stigler was saying was accurate or not.
Okay, so let me move on and talk about what I discovered at Glasgow University 10 years ago. So I fully expected when I went to Glasgow to find the Chicago Adam Smith, who believed in narrow self-interest, attributed economic growth to nothing other than this narrow self-interest. And I did not find him. I found the Kirkcaldy Adam Smith. So then it became really interesting to see how Chicago used Adam Smith in selling their theory. So for instance, George Stigler wrote, "The wealth of nations is a stupendous palace erected upon the granite of self-interest." Adam Smith himself would beg to differ. So where did we get the Chicago Adam Smith? So in my book, I talk about two things. First of all, the German interpretation of Adam Smith's two works were not that good. And they created or fueled this debate in Germany called the Das Adam Smith problem, where it said Adam Smith started his life as this, he may have started as a moral philosopher who believed in norms and altruism and culture, but then he changed and became the Chicago Adam Smith, who believed only in narrow self-interest, at least from an economic perspective. And then as I read Adam Smith's two works, you read The Wealth of Nations, and it does not say what the Chicago School says that it says, unless you take a few phrases out of context. So I now kind of had fun in my graduate courses reading those passages completely out of context, explain how the Chicago School interpreted them, and then read them in their full context. And undergraduates see it, and let alone graduate students see that these statements were clearly taken out of context to support a view of capitalism in the firm that had already been predetermined. So a deeper analysis of Smith's life, I learned the following. He had a full view of capitalism with an emphasis on culture, institutions, and social norms. So like I said, he was born in Kirkcaldy in 1723. He's one of the premier moral philosophers of the Enlightenment. So he attended Glasgow from 1737 to 1740 when it was heavily Presbyterian. He attended Oxford from 1740 to 1746 when it was heavily Anglican. He was appointed professor of logic at the University of Glasgow in 1751 and professor of moral philosophy from 1752 to 1764. Then the next three are very critical. He published the first edition of the Theory of Moral Sentiments in 1759. And that work is what gained him widespread recognition as a leading moral philosopher of the Enlightenment. He published the first edition of The Wealth of Nations later in his career, after he had basically moved on and he had returned from a trip through Europe with the future Duke of Buccleuch. He had introduced himself to the French economists and he'd gotten out of his office and he'd seen the world, and now he wanted to incorporate what he knew and what he had learned from the Theory of Moral Sentiments into The Wealth of Nations. But importantly, he continuously revised his two major works up until his death in 1790. But everybody who wrote during Smith's time and all of Smith's comments reflect that he considered his first work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, his superior and his seminal work. So what I do in my book and what I do first is I go to The Wealth of Nations. And I look at what statements are contained in The Wealth of Nations. And I'm not unique in this regard. Researchers have recently rediscovered the importance of morality and social norms in Adam Smith's second book, including he viewed his economic treatise as a part of a comprehensive system that had the Theory of Moral Sentiments as its foundation. And it included he included content from both major works in his early lectures in Edinburgh and throughout his career. Also, The Wealth of Nations presents a theory of political economy that incorporates institutions and social norms and claims to better the lot of ordinary people. He was a populist. He was not an elitist. The Wealth of Nations grants commerce, religion, education, and government important roles in maintaining high moral character. It grants business professionals both a financial and a non-financial incentive to be honorable and to prove themselves trustworthy. And rather than promote narrow self-interest, it promotes the proper structuring of social institutions to establish and maintain proper virtues and norms. That's the full view of The Wealth of Nations. Now, what about the Theory of Moral Sentiments? What about his first work? Why is it worth going back and reading his first book as context to his second book? So remember, he wrote his last edition of the Theory of Moral Sentiments in 1790, the year that he passed, and it was his sixth edition. And so I picture Adam Smith as he was on his deathbed, and many people say this, agonizing over the moral condition of his country and the West at the time, and thinking about the economic institutions that were coming up in the UK and Europe and now being exported to America. And he went back to his first book and he decided to do yet another revision. And this is what he did. He began by refuting narrow self-interest. So he did this by condemning Mandeville's view of virtue as just being another aspect of narrow self-interest. And then he differentiated between good self-interest, which he called prudence, and bad self-interest, which he called selfishness. And he called the former a virtue. So we've got good self-interest, of course. And then he called the latter a vice that should be discouraged. Smith also grants mankind the ability to empathize with others, which he calls sympathy, and he makes it the major force behind moral judgment and behavior. Then he uses the concept of an impartial spectator to explain the moral conscience. Individuals observe what constitutes praiseworthy behavior over time, and they internalize these behavioral norms. But he didn't stop there. He added a whole new section in his 6th and final edition that emphasized virtue morality and used various virtues to argue for the importance to, or for people to be motivated to not only gather praise, but to also be praiseworthy. So he went beyond just relativism to these standard virtues that were very common within Stoic philosophy. Okay, any comments on that before I talk about the major shift in neoclassical economic thought? Okay, so let's move on. In 2008, I came across an interesting book, and it was edited by economist Paul Zak. And I've had the opportunity to meet Paul Zak and hear some of his presentations expanding neoclassical economic theory. And Princeton University Press published his book entitled Moral Markets, the Critical Role of Values in the Economy. And it contains articles by top researchers discussing the importance of values and norms in economic exchange. And I highly recommend it as one of those books, again, that shows the way to how to expand neoclassical theory. But what I found really interesting was who wrote the foreword. The foreword was written by none other than Michael Jensen. And you look at that foreword, and it was like he had had an out-of-body experience.
A religious
So
conversion.
He argued that economics has far too long ignored the normative world, or the world of values and norms that specify desirable conduct. And he argues for that for a while, and then he concludes, I look forward to seeing the creation of an entirely new field of inquiry in economics and its sister social sciences. Hopefully he was thinking about accounting and finance, focused deeply on the positive analysis of the role of values. Okay, so before you doubt his seriousness, if you look at what Michael Jensen is doing today, he and his colleagues have pivoted completely from excluding any discussion of morality and values to promoting a new positive theory of integrity that encourages managers and students to practice their personal values on the job with authenticity. Now, again, Jensen is incredibly bright. I enjoy his scholarship. When I go back and read his more recent work, though, it's like he's missing so much that happened before the 1960s. The other interesting thing is he is, in his new attempt to sell this perspective, he blames the 2008-2009 meltdown, market meltdown, to this narrow view of capitalism and the firm that he developed out of Rochester and the Chicago School. So he's actually very contrite in saying, we've had something missing and we need to add it. Okay, it's just the way that he's done it has been, again, from a very narrow perspective, and I'm looking forward to him expanding his perspective. So what has pushed us to this point? So again, the narrow view of capitalism in the firm, I think, was very rigorous, very important. It got us to really look at contracts and financial incentives in a deeper, more rigorous way. It opened up a whole new area of econometrics and data analytics. Isn't it funny, Bob? We're seeing the new emphasis on data analytics when it was born in the 1960s at Chicago. But what we're finding is this perspective has its limits. And here are some of the results. First of all, rather than being optimal, incentive contracts are often inefficient and unrelated to performance. So increasingly, firms no longer believe in or use the powerful financial incentives and contracts that are developed through agency theory. There's a whole lot of literature about what corporate boards actually do when they do incentive contracts. And it's more consistent with the Burrell-Means thesis, which says that they basically use incentive contracts to largely enrich top executives. But again, getting back to Greg's theme of get to the crux. The crux is we're finding that incentive contracting has also been found to diminish intrinsic motivation consistent with values and norms. And we've given that a name. We call that crowding out behavior. But also, getting back to what happened in 2008 and 2009, incentive contracting has been found to cause excessive risk-taking behavior, which some believe has put firms and economies at risk.
Doug, I think part of this is I'll call a natural evolution. Going back to Jensen, I mean, I think Bob Kaplan can confirm this. Jensen was one of the first to really push hard on stock option incentives, right? And I think it's fair to say that many executives owe their wealth to what he did, and you should worship at his altar, okay? But then we learned that because of option incentives, there's accounting manipulation, there's stock price manipulation, all kinds of things that were not thought of in the beginning. So, we have to kind of learn by making mistakes. And I think there's an evolution that goes on, and you're picking up on that evolution.
Granted. Yeah, good point.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, please do. Please do. Anybody? Any other comments?
Yeah, if I may, I mean, one issue that drew my attention when you were in the previous. So when you think of your norms, right? It's very hard to actually think of that in terms of conducting research, right? I mean, I have different norms than you have. So if I start from a normative perspective doing research, right, that is going to be detrimental to my research if I would do that. So and it's also it might be even more difficult to understand what other people's norms are, right? So it's actually also very difficult to do the valid research if you take norms as a point of as a starting point for your research, because you end up in totally biased outcomes.
Good point, Jan. I used to believe that, and then when I was trying to interpret my experimental research, I saw that my subjects couldn't act as if they had no norms. And then I started realizing that archival researchers have started, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, they've started to test culture and norm-based behavior in archival studies, and the results have been very remarkable. So yeah, I used to feel the same way, that we were going off an abyss that we may never return from. And no, that's no longer true.
Well, I have no quibbles with subjects of research that they act based on norms. I mean, I have no trouble with that. And what I have trouble with is that the research starts from a normative point of view. That is detrimental to research, in my view.
We found a way to take actually a very positive view and a positive analysis of looking at what is and how people actually behave in firms and in the lab. I like going to the toughest evidence first. So Jan, let's talk first of all about archival research. So based on, like you said, it's a natural evolution that we're now finding some of the shortcomings of that narrow view of capitalism in the firm. And more researchers such as Shyam Sunder and Larker and Tyan, and David Larker does a lot of corporate governance stuff out of Stanford. And they're there. They're saying we need to start looking at informal controls, non-financial controls such as culture and social norms. And we've had a number of publications now in top accounting and finance journals doing this very thing. So Bamberg, Yang, and Wang in 2010, they did a capital markets study, and they found that some top managers exhibit idiosyncratic differences in their corporate reporting. And it's just as if they are reflecting their own professional norms. And they reflect greater transparency, honesty, and integrity than others. And they see this systematic behavior and they argue, this is top management acting as if they have professional norms that they are following above and beyond the financial incentives that they have. And then in 2012, there were a number of publications in top journals that showed that firms located in counties with high religious adherence also were associated with a lower likelihood of financial misreporting. And then a number of publications since have shown that corporate social responsibility is correlated with this idiosyncratic difference, that it often signals that top management is high professional norm or high integrity or high ethics. And you can see this behavior consistent, whether it's adherence to tax law or aggressive reporting. You see firms that tend to have, again, this systematic behavior that is consistent with a strong culture. But by far, getting back to my research, the strongest challenge to the culture-free, norm-free theory of the firm is what's going on in the lab. And in experimental economics, we use games. We love to form economic settings where the economic or dominant prediction is very powerful, and then see if we can get behavior consistent with that dominant prediction. And for decades now, going back to the 80s and 90s, neoclassical economists like Vernon Smith and Charlie Plott, and I shouldn't name names because I'm leaving valuable people out, are finding evidence for systematic norm-based behavior. And in these dictator games and ultimatum games, we can't get people to act as narrow, self-interested agents. They always seem to ask, what is the right thing to do? What am I expected to do? And we have seen norms consistent with fairness, with honesty, with reciprocity. These all have been isolated and now have been manipulated within the lab. So we know they exist. We know we can, and this is something that Steve Saltario and Alan Webb said in their review of Rankin, Schwartz, and Young's paper. We can make the game feel like a game. We can make the participants feel like I just want to make as much money as I can. So that's about the only time we approach the dominant solution. But as you enrich the setting and you make it about providing a financial report or a budget that someone else is going to rely on to make decisions, and that your norm-based behavior is going to affect others' payoffs, then you get these social norms that are consistent and systematic. And Vernon Smith has coined a name for this, and he calls it ecological rationality. And he's actually gone back to Adam Smith and his early writing as well as his later writing. And he says that social norm theory is very powerful, very strong. The impartial spectator is still with us. And we all still want to know, what do we need to do in this setting? And how can we be consistent with the values and the norms that we have seen and we've experienced in our life and in our culture? So I'm glad Mark is here. I started my dissertation at Indiana by reading his JAR paper over and over and over again. And I found participative budgeting experiments to be a great game. It's a great opportunity, and other researchers have joined us now. I won't say that research wouldn't have occurred without Mark Young, but I'll tell you, he was a major reason why it got off the ground by publishing in such a top journal so early. It's taken me a while to get into those top journals with my research, but it's finally starting to happen. And so here's the setting. A slack-inducing pay scheme is commonly used, where the principal pays the agent a bonus for performance relative to the budget. Okay? So clearly in this setting, the dominant prediction of the game is 100% budgetary slack. However, agents commonly present budgets that reflect expected performance, and we can get them to increase their honesty, again, by simply enhancing the budgeting setting. So researchers have used this setting to test social norm behavior, such as honesty, fairness, reciprocity, and responsibility. And they've demonstrated that cues in the participative budgeting setting can activate these social norms in the agent. And we're now to the point where we are starting to, and this is what experimentalists are good at, we're starting to examine the agents themselves. We're getting into the black box, and we're looking at differential norm sensitivity that affects their responsiveness to these situational cues. So let's stop right there. Are there any questions before I talk about my latest experimental evidence? Okay, I'd like to present some evidence in a recent experiment with Heba Abdelrahim, one of my doctoral students, very talented.
Yeah, let Doug go on. It's his seminar, so let's hear his research. So I'll comment at the end.
Okay. And then Jing Liu at Chapman. And what we do is we extend a series of experiments designed to examine the ability of an information system to induce greater budgetary reporting honesty absent financial incentives. So this is based on Koford and Penno's 1992 paper, where they talk about how agency theory could be expanded to include ethics or morality. And Mark Penno's models are very interesting, and I've done some principal agent work in this area as well. And what they say is we could incorporate moral sensitivity into the principal agent model by either modeling as if some agents are going to be fully self-interested and then some agents are going to be fully moral. And then he shows how the model is better able to describe certain behavior. And then he gives another example and he says, we could also model morality or ethics as if everybody could be encouraged to act more morally, given the cues or given training. And he went on to talk about the rich extension of agency theory and the new results that would come out of that assumption. And what's funny is we started by using the first assumption. So Evans et al. In their 2001 accounting review said, let's see if we have people who are purely self-interested and whether we find people who are purely honest. And what they found is a lot of behavior across the spectrum. So they argued for the second assumption, which is most people can be motivated or can be trained, or their impartial spectator can be activated. And so it really opened up a whole new way of thinking about these social norms. So Hannon, Rankin, and Towery, in their experiment, they said, we haven't demonstrated conclusively that a better information system leads to better honesty. So they test that in the lab, and they found that going from no information system to a coarse information system increases honesty. But then going from a coarse information system to a more refined information system reduces honesty. So they had a non-linear relationship. And what Hava did in her second year paper at Georgia State is she looked at their experimental design and said that they had a lot of uncertainty in their information system that still left a lot of information asymmetry, even in the precise information system. So in our 2018 AOS paper, when we reduced that uncertainty from 70% to 90%, we found a linear relationship between going from no information system to a coarse information system to a precise information system. So now what we want to do is we want to look at the role of a person's, let's see, let me get this right. So what we want to do is we wanted to look at whether the superior's choice to implement the information system diminished its behavioral benefit. And then given that we're experimentalists, we can do this. We wanted to manipulate, or first of all, see how distrust interacted with norm sensitivity in this crowding out effect. So we test the following hypotheses. Hypothesis 1, the superior's choice to implement an information system will be perceived as a signal of distrust by the agent or subordinates. Then, because of this inconsistency in the literature, we tested, first of all, that there would be a positive behavioral effect of an information system on the subordinates reporting honesty. And then in hypothesis 2, we test whether the positive behavioral effect of an information system on subordinates reporting honesty will be reduced when superiors choose to implement the information system. And then hypothesis 3, whether this reduction in the behavioral benefit of an information system would be due to the superior's implementation choice, whether that would be driven primarily by the superior, the subordinates or the agents who had high norm sensitivity. So let me just say what Hannon, Rankin, and Towery said in some early versions of their paper was that the precise information system made it too costly for the subordinates to appear honest. So they attributed their result to what they called a what the hell effect. So they said, since I can't appear to be honest, it's too costly, I'm going to go all the way and be dishonest. At least I can go home from the experiment having made as much money as I can. So what we're going to do in this experiment is, and we didn't put it in any of our earlier drafts, but we're going to look at another what the hell effect. And this what the hell effect is, if you have a subordinate who has high sensitivity for social norms and would be motivated to be honest anyway, and then you have their superior impose an information system that more clearly reflects the amount of honesty in their budget, they may have a what the hell effect too and say, why didn't they trust me? Why didn't they? Maybe there are other subordinates who are not as honest as I am. And so we test whether this crowding out effect that is found in these experiments is actually generated by people who have high social norm sensitivity. So we manipulate within subjects the presence of a highly precise and accurate information system. And then we manipulate the source of that information system. So in every setting, a person either has an information system or they don't. And that information system, the way we manipulate it, could either be the result of a random assignment from the computer, or it could be due to the superior selecting the information system. Okay, in the interest of time. So here is the strong prediction from game theory. So how much honesty would we expect to find based on narrow opportunistic behavior from game theory? 0. So 0 with an information system or not, 0 with random assignment or superior choice. And this is what we find. So with no information system, we get the lowest amount of honesty. But an information system that only reflects or increases the transparency of the amount of honesty, we get a large increase in honesty. And it's even, it's higher with random assignment than when it's purposefully chosen by the superior's choice. And what we find is this reduction here, this crowding out, is due to a signal of distrust. We find that high norm sensitivity agents reduce their honesty more due to the signal of distrust than the low norm sensitivity. Okay, and so this again reflects the presence of social norms, and we're now able to get more into social norm sensitivity and the individual members, individual measures. I want to quickly mention what's going on in Archival, then I want to open it up to comments. The same shift in thinking is occurring in capital markets research. So because I do trading volume research, I have seen evidence that trading volume reactions around earnings announcements have been increasing since the 1980s. It is now occurring in price reactions. Price reactions around earnings announcements are now increasing dramatically since 2001. And so you now have papers like Beaver, McNichols, and Wang, and my paper with Richard Schneibel and Ori Barron, demonstrating this strong increase in the reaction, both price and volume, around earnings announcements. So in our latest study, we have three hypotheses. One, that the increase in informativeness reflected in analyst forecasts around annual earnings announcements is greater in recent time periods. Number two, the commonality of information reflected in analyst forecasts prior to annual earnings announcements is lower in recent time periods. Excuse me. And hypothesis three, that the ability of annual earnings announcements to increase the commonality of information or level the playing field reflected in analyst forecasts is greater in recent time periods. And we use both forecast dispersion and our BKLS forecast proxies. And in the interest of time, we find support for all three. Dispersion is decreasing more around around earnings announcements. Consensus is increasing more. What we have is this interesting result where pre-announcement informativeness is lower and consensus in the pre-announcement period is lower. And so earnings announcements now play a larger role in leveling the playing field. Okay, so I am 3 slides short, but I want to stop now. And are there any comments or questions related to this research? I wish I had more time. What are the implications for accounting theory and practice? I have 2 more slides. So we're to the point, and I'll go to Cathari. In his JAE review of financial capital markets research and accounting, he pointed the continued evidence of post-earnings announcement drift and discussed the challenge that it posed for market efficiency. And he said, we are at the same point that we were back in the 1960s at the University of Chicago. We can no longer overlook this anomaly. And he encouraged researchers to go on with adapting or expanding our theory to include at least partially inefficient markets. But he didn't mention anything about individual disagreement. He didn't mention anything about trading volume. And that research just went on, but it was not emphasized in the Chicago school. And I will add this persistent evidence of social norm behavior in the lab. So I agree with Cathari, and I say we are ready for a paradigm shift like we had back in the 1960s. But I also agree with people like Blancaspor, Dehaan, and Marinovich that the new paradigm should maintain as much of the old paradigm as possible. And I include in this the persistence of rational expectations or rationality. So for instance, investor disagreement doesn't have to come from irrational behavior. It could be just the result of disclosure processing costs, which again is something we as accountants should be very interested in. I also argue that we should continue the rich insights from the original theory of the firm. It's not necessary to abandon the richness and rigor of that theory. And again, Mark Penno and theorists have been doing it now for decades, and we need to acknowledge their work. But I do believe that this new research paradigm should be open to normative public policy related research. Leveling the information playing field, looking at efficiencies in market has a normative reason as well as a public policy. And so we should look at both positive theory and yes, normative theory, which economists, turns out, have been doing for centuries. Now, I think that we can safely call this new paradigm the new Chicago school because it does not abandon where we've come from, but builds on that. So again, I wish I had another half hour or hour to to gather your comments. Please email me with your comments and questions, and
Yeah. Well, Doug,
don't
just
call
quickly,
me.
yeah. Doug, first of all, thanks for this eclectic view and historical view of research, which is very interesting. Let me just point you that kind of the generalization of agency theory is already underway. There's many economists that are working beyond the narrow assumptions of the 1970s. And in particular, Bob Gibbons is someone that I've talked a lot with, and kind of a leader of he's an organizational economist and works on relationship contracts. And I think you might find that literature very compatible with the kinds of experiments you're running, because it does talk about, in effect, a multi-period version of agency theory, where people will behave the way you and others are documenting in the laboratory. And that actually provides a more robust foundation for the work you're doing than, the 1970s, effort-averse version of agency theory.
Thank you, Bob. Appreciate your comments.
Very interesting seminar. Thank you very much. Learned a lot.
Thank you,
Agree.
Paul. Appreciate your comments.
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you, Greg. I'll catch up with you later.
Okay, take care.
Yep.
Are there another questions? If anyone have any questions, you can open your mic. Thank you very much, dear Professor Doug Stevens, for your contribution and your effort. It's really an excellent presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And it's all that remains for me. Thank you everyone that joined us, and I thank you very much for taking the time out to present to us today, dear Professor Doug Stevens. It's been really appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you.